Welcome back, everyone. This is part two of a new series with Rabbi Federow, where we're going through a lot of the passages in the Bible which have been really badly misused by the Christian text. And we're starting off with Isaiah 53. Last week's program was an introduction and an example of how things are retrofitted and how they take one story and twist it to mean something else. And now we are jumping straight into Isaiah 53, although we're probably starting somewhere in 52, if memory serves.
Well, we have a little bit of information to go through before we get to that point.
Okay.
Okay, because if you take a look at Isaiah 53, Isaiah didn't begin in a vacuum. Okay, Isaiah was well aware of the Torah. Okay, Isaiah would have been well aware of everything in the Torah. So there are other things we have to understand that Isaiah would have understood that preclude seeing Isaiah 53 being about Jesus. Okay, so first, let's ask a question. The Bible is explicitly clear if you read in Deuteronomy 24:16. It explicitly says, Ish bechet o yumatu. Everyone is to be put to death for his own sin. You also find this in Exodus 32, verses 30 to 35. And the Eternal said unto Moses, whosoever has sinned against me, him will I blot out of my book. The person who sins is the one who gets the death penalty. And again in Ezekiel 18, verses 1 through 4, and verse 20 to 24, and verse 26 to 27, behold, all souls are mine, as the soul of the Father, so also the soul of the Son is mine. The soul that sins shall die. Now we're still reading in Ezekiel chapter 18, but now verse 20. Again it repeats, the soul that sins, it shall die. The Son shall not bear the sin of the Father, neither shall the Father bear the sin of the Son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him. It doesn't say the wickedness of the wicked shall be on the righteous. It says the wickedness of the wicked shall be on the wicked. Repeatedly, consistently, without any need to interpret, the text literally and clearly states that the person who does the sin is the person who gets the punishment for the sin. So the question before we come to Isaiah 53 is, did God change his mind? If God changed his mind, miraculously, if God said, quote, Deuteronomy 24:16, every man is to be put to death for his own sin, then the only way we can interpret Isaiah 53 to mean the opposite, that Jesus died for your sin, is only if God changed his mind. Or maybe he didn't change his mind. Maybe he just didn't mean what he said when he said every man shall be put to death for his own sin. Understand that the interpretation Christians give to our Isaiah 53 is exactly that. It's an interpretation. And as a person were actually to read Isaiah 53, you can have other interpretations. You can have the Jewish interpretation, which has been around for thousands of years. You can have the Christian interpretation. Anybody can read any verse of the Bible any way they want to. But if we have verses elsewhere in the Tanakh that preclude the interpretation that someone else gives, we have to reject their interpretation as unbiblical. We have the verse from Deuteronomy 24:16. We have the verses from Exodus 32, 30 to 35. We have the verses from Ezekiel chapter 18. All say that the person who does the sin is the only person who gets the punishment for that sin. You can't take a look at the Christian interpretation of Isaiah 53 and ignore these other passages from the Tanakh. You have to understand that their interpretation of Isaiah 53 is simply unbiblical, as is Christianity as a whole.
It'd be kind of like someone running out onto a football field with a tennis racket and starting to punt the ball around with a tennis racket, right? There are
Exactly.
rules laid down.
Exactly. And everybody would laugh at the person with the tennis racket and kick them off the field. And that's what we have to do effectively, is kick off the field the Christian interpretation of Isaiah 53, because it's unbiblical. Many of the verses in the Christian's New Testament that describe the life and times of Jesus contradict the image described in Isaiah 53. And it's probably because no matter how hard the authors tried to create stories, invent stories about Jesus that would fit images found in the Hebrew Scriptures, the factual stories about the man Jesus were also recorded by them, And it's these stories that deny any messiahship of Jesus, as well as contradict the image of the suffering servant that we read in Isaiah 53. So we have to take a closer look at what Isaiah 53 says, like taking a closer look at Pinocchio, and then compare it with other passages from the Christian's New Testament. Now, 2 verses in the Isaiah passage describe the servant of God as having been either too ugly to be human in appearance or too plain looking to make us notice him. Isaiah 52 verse 14, so we're still talking about the Isaiah 53 passage, even though it's Isaiah 52. It says in verse 14, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the sons of men. And Isaiah 53 verse 2 reads, he had no form or comeliness that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. Jason, have you ever seen a picture painted of Jesus where he's an ugly man? In the West, he is portrayed as a tall, thin, muscular, because he was a carpenter, blonde, blue-eyed man. You know, in Africa, he's obviously a black man. Okay, in Asia, he's portrayed as being Asian, but they don't portray him as ugly. They portray him as being good-looking, contradicting the Isaiah passage. But more importantly, okay, there's a text in the New Testament itself that makes it look like Jesus was good-looking and thought to be good-looking by the people. In Luke chapter 2, verse 52, it says that Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. So obviously, if the description of Isaiah 53, verse 2, and also Isaiah 52, verse 14, is of a man who was too ugly to look at, okay, it's being contradicted by Luke chapter 2, verse 52, where it says that Jesus increased in stature and in favor with God and man. Going back to our Isaiah 53 passage, it says that in Isaiah 53, verse 3, it says, it describes the servant as being a loner without anybody to call a friend. It says in Isaiah 53, verse 3, he was despised and rejected by men. Now, Isaiah 53, verse 3 is not describing a man who, at one point in his life, some people reject him, but it's describing someone who has known rejection throughout his life. But in many places within the Christian's New Testament, like the above quotation from Luke chapter 2, verse 52, Jesus is described as having a huge following from the beginning of his ministry all the way to the scene at the crucifixion. So, for example, Matthew 21, verse 46, when they tried to arrest him, they feared the multitudes because they held him to be a prophet. That's not someone who's despised and rejected by men. In Luke chapter 23, verse 26 to 27, and as they led him away, they seized one Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. And there followed him a great multitude of the people and of women who bewailed and lamented him. That also doesn't sound like he was rejected by men. You see this repeatedly described in the Christian's New Testament. Take a look at Mark chapter 14, verse 1 through 2, Matthew chapter 4, verse 24 to 25, Matthew chapter 21, verse 9 and verse 11, Luke chapter 4, verses 14 and 15, Luke chapter 7, verses 11, 12, and 16, Luke chapter 8, verses 4, 19, and 45, and John chapter 12, verse 11 and verse 42. All describe the multitudes following Jesus up to and including the crucifixion. So we see that unlike the servant described in Isaiah 53, verse 3, Jesus was not despised, he was not rejected by men, but instead he maintained a large following all the way through his preaching career. Now, 2 quotations from the Isaiah passage describe someone who remains silent when they're accused by their captors, one who is innocent of any wrongdoing. Isaiah 53 verse 7 reads, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shears is dumb, he opened not his mouth. You also have a verse in Isaiah 53 verse 9 which reads, and there was no deceit in his mouth. So Isaiah 53 verse 7 verse 9 is referring to someone who keeps his mouth quiet when he's like a lamb before its shears, doesn't say a word. And in verse 9, does not use his mouth to deceive people.
I just want to jump in as well there. The phrase about the lamb before its shearers, that's also talking about somebody who not only doesn't talk, but knows that they're about to have something taken from them, right? They don't fight back. The lamb just lays there and lets the person take its wool. There's no argument. There's no, I want to get out. There's no, can you get me out? There's no, is there any way of changing this? The lamb just lays there and lets that happen.
And remember, it's because the lamb knows the lamb's not going to die. Take my wool and let me give me my haircut and let me get out of here.
I've seen sheep in this late spring who have had their pelts taken, and they love it, right? They get their fresh air and they're jumping around, all the weight's off their back. And after a season, they're used to that. They know what's going to happen. They kind of look forward to it.
Right. So again, the image taken from Isaiah and then supposedly describing Jesus, it doesn't fit. If you take a look at the Christian's New Testament, it states that Jesus did rebuke his captors, and in so doing, he did actually open his mouth. John chapter 18, verse 22 to 23. When he had said this, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If I have spoken wrongly, bear witness to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" So Jesus is rebuking his captors for having slapped him. Keep that in mind. Okay. And he says, if I did something wrong, tell me what I did wrong. But if I didn't speak anything wrong, why'd you hit me? So he's rebuking his captors for what he considers mistreatment. And by the way, this contradicts something we know Jesus also said of turning the other cheek in Matthew chapter 5, verse 39. Turn the other, if someone smites you with the right cheek, turn to him his left. Jesus didn't do that. That makes Jesus a hypocrite, giving advice that he himself doesn't take. So hypocrisy is a form of deceit because it deceives people in doing what the deceiver himself does not do. And that violates what we just read about Isaiah 53, verse 9, talking about the servant suffering for God. There's no deceit in his mouth. But Jesus deceives people because he's a hypocrite. He says, turn the other cheek, but when he himself was slapped, he didn't do it. He would turn the other cheek.
He spends nearly half of his time giving the public parables rather than the actual truth, which he has to explain to the disciples behind closed doors. That's very deceitful.
So, yes, that means he didn't really want his followers to know what the truth was, which, by the way, is what we earlier talked about, Christians claiming rabbis kept the truth of Isaiah 53 from their congregants. One of the verses in Isaiah talks about a man of peace. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 9. It says, although he had done no violence, it's basically talking about violence being done to him. Even though he didn't deserve it, he had these things happen to him. But there are plenty of cases where Jesus is one of the most violent men in all of any literature. So, for example, what about the violence Jesus did in quote-unquote cleansing the temple? So Matthew chapter 21, verse 12 reads, and Jesus entered the temple of God and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And in John chapter 2, verse 15, it actually shows that Jesus made himself his own whip so he could whip people. John chapter 2, verse 15, and when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew the tables. Now, Christians might say, well, you could call that violence, but that was justified violence because, Jesus didn't want that in the temple. Well, the verse in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 9 reads, no violence at all. And those who bought and sold in the temple, they were there because God commanded them to be there. In Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 24 to 26, God explicitly told the Jews to sell the animal they wanted to sacrifice, take the money that they sold it for to Jerusalem, and then when they get to Jerusalem, to the temple, that they're supposed to change the money to the local currency, buy the animal, the same animal that they wanted to sacrifice, and then go sacrifice it. That means that the money changers and the sellers of sacrificial animals had to be there as commanded by God. Deuteronomy 14, 24 to 26. And if the way be too long for you, so that you are not able to carry it, or if the place is too far from you, which the eternal your God chooses to set his name there. When the eternal your God's blessed you, you shall then turn it into money, bind up the money in your hand. You shall go to the place which the eternal your God shall choose, and you shall bestow the money for whatever your soul lusts after, for oxen or for sheep or for wine or for strong drink or for whatever your soul desires. And you shall eat there before the eternal your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your household. Remember, the sacrifices, not all of them were burnt offerings. Most of them were not fully burnt up. If you pardon the pun, you gave the animal to the Kohen, the priest. He slaughtered it. If you'll pardon the pun, he took his cut, and then you would get the rest of it and have your festival meal. So Deuteronomy 14, God tells people, change it into money, go to the money changers, buy from the people selling the sacrifices your sacrifice, and then go sacrifice and enjoy yourself because it's a holiday, a chag. So Jesus is going against what God himself had ordained to be there.
And he's stopping a whole load of people from being able to fulfill that commandment themselves because he's destroying any opportunity they have to do it.
Absolutely correct. So when they talk about Jesus, the man of peace, he's one of the most violent people you will ever see. There are other examples in the Christian's New Testament. In Mark 11, verse 12, Jesus condemns a fruit tree to death because it didn't have any figs on it for him to eat, but the text itself said it wasn't the right season for figs. So Jesus kills a tree because he himself couldn't eat when it wasn't time for figs to be there.
And what strikes me about that is that he's supposed to have these miraculous powers, right? So if he can sum up enough bread and fish for 5,000, why can't he make a fig?
There's a number of interesting things about that story. Increasingly, Jesus supposedly did miracles to feed people with less and less, and he fed more and more. And every single time, the stupid disciples didn't believe he could do it. Okay, the first time you don't believe he could do it, I can understand. But the second time, after you saw it the first time, he's got more people to feed and less food to do it with, but he did the first miracle. You don't believe him on the second or the third? Okay, so in Mark chapter 11, verses 12 to 14, and then later verses 20 to 21. And on the morrow when they were come from Bethany, he was hungry, and seeing a fig tree afar off having leaves, he came, if it might find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for the time of figs was not yet. And Jesus answered and said to it, no man shall eat fruit from you hereafter, forever. And his disciples heard it. And then later in verse 20 it reads, and in the morning as they passed by, they saw the fig tree dried up from its roots, and Peter, calling to remembrance, said to him, Master, behold, the fig tree which you cursed has withered away. Don't we praise God as the creator of the fruit of the tree, Borei Pri Ha'etz? So if Jesus were supposedly God, why can he only destroy? Why can't he create?
I think to remember there's this explicit Torah command about destroying fruit trees as well.
Yeah, absolutely, which gives rise to the Jewish concept of al tashchit, which means basically don't waste anything that can still be used. That's a very interesting thing in Judaism. You can actually take the verse in Deuteronomy and take it through every level of Jewish law, how that verse was dealt with in the Bible, then in the Mishnah, then in the Talmud, then in the codes, then in the responsa. You can see how it develops from that one verse, how we shouldn't waste anything that can still be used. So repeatedly we see that Jesus was a violent man, and Isaiah 53 verse 9 describes the suffering servant as someone who had done no violence.
Oh, we didn't mention the pigs. So he apparently healed some guy of his demon possession and put the demons into these pigs when he could have put them into the ground or the sea or the sky or a tree, and then drowns these pigs which don't even belong to him.
Jason, if he was God, he could have killed the demons. He could have said, okay, demons, you're gone. But instead, he takes innocent piggies, okay, and destroys these piggies by making them jump themselves into the ocean to kill the demons. Well, if he's supposedly God, he doesn't eat piggies. He just gets the demons out and kills them.
And I'm still not sure how that's not stealing. If he didn't give the guy any money for those pigs.
Yes, right. But Jason, he's God, so he owns all of heaven and earth anyway. So I guess that's how they would get around it. Okay. By the way, more violence from Jesus. And this is important to understand because of the history of Christianity's treatment of the Jewish people. Luke chapter 19, verse 27. In Luke 19, Jesus is telling a parable. And he's telling a parable about a king who has to go away to get crowned and then come back. And when that king comes back, okay, he makes the following statement. This is Luke 19, verse 27. But those who are my enemies, who would not allow that I should reign over them, bring them to me and slay them in front of me. Luke 19:27. Real nice guy. If they don't allow me to reign over them, kill them.
So I've heard, I just want to have, so I have brought that up with people before, and they'll say, well, it's a parable. And you say, well, what's the parable about? I go, well, a king coming back to his kingdom. I go, yeah, and what just happened? Jesus has just come to Jerusalem. How can you not see that it's him he's talking about? It's so obvious.
Every single Christian commentary from Matthew Henry on up and before Matthew Henry understands that Jesus is talking about himself. Okay?
Because if he isn't, what's the point of that parable?
And some Christian preachers will say that Jesus is talking about his second coming here, that he goes away to heaven and comes back. Okay? But the point is that they admit Jesus is talking about himself, and he has himself saying, those who are my enemies, if they won't allow me to reign over them, bring them in front of me and kill them. That's about as violent as you can get. And more importantly, wouldn't that explain Christians' justification for slaying so many Jews throughout the centuries simply because we reject Jesus? Wouldn't that also have a better expression of Isaiah 53? Because it says, although they have done no violence, okay, they still get death. And we didn't do anything to deserve the Holocaust. We didn't do anything to deserve the pogroms. We didn't do anything to deserve the Crusaders as they would go through the Jewish areas of Europe on the way to Jerusalem, kill every man, woman, and child. We didn't deserve any of that. We had done no violence, but we got slaughtered. So again, we see that Jesus didn't fulfill Isaiah 53 because of his violence. As a matter of fact, we didn't bring this one up. In Luke 22, verse 36, he tells his disciples to go and buy swords. Okay, so he's not a peace-loving servant who did no violence like Isaiah 53 describes. And finally, there's one verse in the Isaiah passage which describes the suffering servant of God as living a long life and having children. It's Isaiah 53, verse 10. He shall see his zerah, his offspring, his seed. He shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days. That's what Isaiah 53, verse 10 says about the servant who suffers for God. Now, quite obviously, Jesus never married. He had no children. He died in his 30s, which was a young age. Christians may say, oh, well, actually, Isaiah meant disciples when he said the word offspring or seed, or that the Christians themselves are like his children. But the problem is that the Hebrew word is the word zarah, which means seed, and only can refer to a bloodline descendant, his physical, biological children. And one can see this clearly in a passage from Genesis chapter 15, verses 2 through 4, where Abraham, here he's still Abram, is afraid that he has no biological heirs, and the only one that can inherit from him is his servant Eliezer, whom Abram calls his Ben, his son. But God says, it's not going to be your Ben, your son, that's going to inherit from you, but your seed. And explicitly it uses the text zarah, just like Isaiah 53, verse 10 uses the word zarah, seed, or zerah. So Genesis 15, verses 2 through 4 reads, and Abram said, Eternal God, what will you give me, seeing that I have no children? And the son, the Ben, of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. Then Abram said, see to me, you have given me no seed, zarah, biological child, and the Ben, the son of my house, is my heir. Suddenly the word of God came to him, saying, that one will not inherit you, None but him that shall come forth from within your bowels will be your heir. So distinguishing in Genesis 15, verse 2 through 4, between Zerah, meaning biological child, and Ben, meaning son, we see that Isaiah 53, verse 10, he shall see his seed, has to be about this suffering servant's biological children. And Jesus had no biological children. So again, Jesus did not fulfill the description of Isaiah 53 because he had no seed, no children, no offspring. One final thing. Let's assume Isaiah was making a prophecy of Isaiah's future, rather than interpreting his past as the past tenses of his speech indicate. In that case, Isaiah 53 could be applied not only to the people of Israel in the days of Isaiah and all the things that had occurred to them before that, but you could also take a look at history, our history. So reread the Isaiah passage, but think of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust or the pogroms or the Inquisition or the Crusades or other Christian persecutions of Jews as you read it. And ask yourself, what violence did these Jews do to deserve the fate given to them by Christians? Jesus didn't fulfill Isaiah 53. He didn't fulfill any of the real and important prophecies concerning the true Messiah either. Okay, I want to say one final thing because it has to do with the translations. And people learn Hebrew. Jason, you know this movie, this video that keeps going around about they're interviewing Israelis. If an Israeli were to actually pick up and read the text of Isaiah 53, they would see that it couldn't be about Jesus if they really took a careful look at the Hebrew. Okay, and just two quick examples, okay, of the mistranslations almost every Christian translation uses. Okay, verse 9. Okay, they made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death. But the last word in the Hebrew is more accurately translated as in his deaths, because the word appears in the Hebrew in the plural. The Hebrew reads b'motav. There's a yud there, and it indicates the plural, and anybody who knows Hebrew knows that. To read in his death, it would have to say b'moto, but the Hebrew there is b'motav, which means in his deaths. So the word is actually in his deaths. For Jesus to fulfill that, I guess he has to come back to earth and die a second time or a third time or a fourth time to make a plural death. And the Jews personified as the servant, as we have clearly seen in history, have fulfilled this verse time and time again because the people of Israel have had countless millions die an undeserved death. So you have millions of deaths of the Jews and only one death of Jesus. It can't be Jesus fulfilling the deaths of Isaiah 53. Okay. Another example, which comes from Isaiah chapter 52, verse 14, and this is also clear in the Hebrew. Who was Isaiah preaching to? He was preaching to the Jews. And in preaching to the Jews, he says to them, this is Isaiah 52, verse 14, as many were astonished at you, not at him, but at you. So Isaiah is speaking to the Jewish people. It's clear that he's talking about this whole passage referring to the Jewish people to whom he's speaking. So you got to be careful with the translations to learn Hebrew.
Learn Hebrew.
Yes.
Right. Well, thank you very much for that. That's awesome. Will you join us again soon and go through another one of these?
Be happy to.
Right, guys. So that was Isaiah 53. I hope you enjoyed it. I did. And we'll see you all again soon. If you've got any comments or requests, please leave them underneath the video. And head over to whatjewsbelieve.org. Head over to Amazon and buy yourself a copy of Judaism, Christianity at Contrast. And run over to Facebook, where you can find Rabbi Federow on Facebook as well. He's always got a very active page. And we'll see you all again super soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.